Hello, everybody. Today's lectures will be on conservation biology, specifically looking at the effects of human demography, wealth creation, and techno-optimism, causing and solving conservation problems. I'm Wojciech Novotný from Biology Center of the Czech Academy of Sciences, also teaching at the University of South Bohemia and leading the New Guinea Binatang Research Center. So first, what do we want from biodiversity conservation? Well, there are actually a lot of agendas, and not everybody interested in biodiversity agrees on what the goal is. So we can start with the position that we have no right to harm living organisms and ecosystems, the moral argument. Also, biophilia as a trait of our own species. Biodiversity is interesting and aesthetically pleasing, product of evolution, and we can't recreate it, so we need to protect it. Also, the health motivation. Biodiversity is essential for healthy life. The more strictly utilitarian argument, there is an economic value to be had from biodiversity. And also sometimes biodiversity protection is a way for our civilization to return to the natural state, whatever that is, of human civilization, and that sometimes fuels arguments for the social change. So it's basically social engineering argument. In summary, conservation is not science. It's a mix of philosophy and politics, value judgment. So we can't scientifically prove that we have to conserve biodiversity. But at the same time, scientific approach to conservation can provide us with scenarios. What is the likely consequence of certain course of action? And that is what we as biologists should be doing. So let's start with the question of what is the key problem of conservation we are facing. And I'm going to argue that that is growing human population. All other problems you can think of, species extinctions, environmental pollution, which includes climate change, non-sustainable use of resources, habitat destruction, fragmentation, alien biota, that all are secondary problems, and severity of these depends on growing human population. I can back up this argument also by some famous colleagues, Jane Goodall. It's a population growth that underlies just about every single one of the problems that we have inflicted on the planet. And David Attenborough, all environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people. That's I think, very obvious. There is also counter argument to that, saying that it's developed countries which cause most of the environmental damage because they have a higher per capita ecological footprint. And so poor people do not matter, environmentally speaking. To that, I would put my counter argument, and that is the poor people of today and their children are either rich people of tomorrow, and that means environmentally relevant and significant, or they remain poor people of tomorrow. And to me, that attitude is not acceptable. We have to look at ways how this is not going to happen. So the argument that the focus on population is wrong, and sometimes would even say neocolonialist, or if you're on Twitter, then you would say it's racist. That argument implicitly assumes that there will never be economic advancement for poor people. So let that sink in, and then perhaps revise your argument that population does not matter. China provides an excellent example of how population might be important. In 1950s, all the way to the end of the last century, China was indeed not relevant environmentally. But now China is the single highest emitter of carbon dioxide. When the Kyoto Protocol, the first treaty aimed to limit carbon dioxide emissions, was negotiated, China was so unimportant that it was actually not included together with other developing countries into that carbon dioxide targets set by Kyoto. That, of course, has changed a lot since then. When you look at the relative importance of CO2 emissions, then China equals the current production of carbon dioxide by US and all the 28 European countries combined. Even historically, we can argue that when we accumulate all the carbon dioxide emissions throughout the human history, then China may not be so important, but it's heading towards higher importance very fast. So currently, China is number 3 when counting historical carbon dioxide, and but the closing the gap between it and Europe and US. So this increase importance of China changed the politics of carbon dioxide emissions from being the fault of the rich countries to a more complex one, and that was because a combination of gigantic per capita increase in GDP of China, and you can see here that's basically a runaway increase by 1,400% based on the 1950 baseline, unlike any other country, any other large country in the world. And at the same time, significant rise in population, which, however, is comparable with India. And so it started from a large number in 1950s and then continued to grow. So the current prominence is a combination of both factors. And so we can, of course, ask a very reasonable question whether India is going to be the next China in terms of environmental impact. The population is certainly there for that, and India is actually firmly on course to become the most populous country in the world, and that will happen very soon. And so when we look at why the China is still much more important in environmental pollution, that's the gap in GDP, which is still significant. Also, there is an efficiency curve. When countries are poor, then their emission intensity, that means the amount of carbon dioxide produced per unit of value of GDP created, is relatively low. Then when country industrializes, typically with dirty industries, then that emission actually goes up per capita, and then only when country becomes rich again and the industry becomes more sophisticated, then it goes down. And so we can expect that India, if it manages to grow its GDP, and that's of course what most of Indians want, then not only it will multiply the per capita GDP with huge population, but also the emission intensity probably will go from relatively low to relatively high, where China is now, and before it starts going down. And so there is a huge potential for China to be replaced in importance of carbon dioxide by India unless technology changes. When we model that India will close the GDP gap with China, so that means that the per capita GDP will increase to the current Chinese levels. Then in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, the increase will be so huge coming from the Indian value to the Chinese value that it will actually compensate complete current European emissions and basically wipe out most of the American and entire European efforts to become carbon neutral. So Europe can easily become carbon neutral, but it can all be compensated by India unless the carbon dioxide efficiency is not changed globally. Now, we can also ask whether Nigeria is going to be the next India. When you look at the prediction of population growth from the current time to the end of the century, then China and India will switch their place as the two very populous countries, but then Nigeria, which is relatively insignificant at the moment, will escalate the population, and the predictions are it will become the second most populous nation on earth after India and in front of China. However unexpected it might sound. So when we look at the modeling of the number of workforce per country, that China has already peaked, and we will be discussing the reasons for that later, and it's on decline. India is predicted to peak its workforce in 2045, and Nigeria will be overtaking China and coming relatively close to India by the end of the century. And so we can ask, what happened to GDP of Nigeria, currently, of course, extremely low per capita, and whether this will be not another important source of environmental impact. When you look at some modeling of the global economies by size, then currently US is the #1. It will be probably overtaken by China in the mid-century, but then exactly because of the Chinese decline in workforce, is scheduled again to overtake China at the end of the century. However, sort of fantastical or uncertain these predictions might be. India is scheduled to increase through the ranks to the #3 place, and Nigeria, currently completely insignificant at #28, is predicted to steady rise into the first 10 of the countries in terms of GDP by the end of the century. So this is just to show, these are very uncertain predictions, but it's just to show that when thinking about the environmental impact, we have to look at these demographic and economic predictions. Because unfortunately, even now with the current technology, the carbon dioxide emissions remain closely linked to the wealth of the nations. These graphs, I will be showing a number of them. They show every bubble is one country. The color corresponds to the regions with the key here. And the size of the bubble corresponds to size of the population. And so here you have the per capita income, the wealth of the countries against the per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see an extremely nice, for a social phenomenon like this, there is an extremely tight correlation, and which is actually bad news, because that means that when you interpret this figure, you can also say that because this area of high carbon dioxide emissions and low wealth is empty, that you can say that no country emitting enough carbon dioxide managed to stay poor, except of course for North Korea, which came fairly close. You can also say that this area is empty so far, and so no rich country manages to have low carbon dioxide emissions. My argument will be that without breaking this pattern by new technologies, we are doomed. So what are the solutions of environmental problems? As I already mentioned, there are basically two groups of people, techno-optimists and techno-pessimists. Techno-optimists, they can be genuine optimists, where they think that technological progress solves more problems than it causes. And nobody, of course, denies that a lot of problems are caused by technology, but the balance is firmly on the side of technology, and so we need more of it. And then there are also people who are not convinced entirely about that, but then they basically say that we have gone too far in playing these technology games. So now technology is causing a lot of problems, and if we stop developing it, these problems will overtake us. We have to simply stay in the game and just keep developing more and more technology, which of course will start a new unexpected problems, but will also solve the very, very serious problems we have now. And then, of course, there are techno-pessimists who are saying that technological progress is dangerous by and large, causes a net increase in problems. And so the solution is not more and maybe even less technology, and that, of course, leads inevitably to lower consumption. I have to say that I am firmly in the techno-optimism camp. I don't really see that there is willingness for less consumption. And if we keep consumption constant or increasing, then technology is the only way which can make it possible without ruining the planet. Basically, these environmental problems go back to Thomas Malthus, an 18th, 19th century very influential economist, pointing out the ever-existing disparity between the demands of the population, which tends to increase in exponential way, and the material subsistence, which increases much slower in, as he said, in arithmetical ratio. This is the mentions of Thomas Malthus in the literature. So although he was most famous at the turn of the 18th, 19th century, he remains to be steadily cited for the last more than 200 years, which few scientists or intellectuals achieve. And it's, of course, his essay on the principle of population, which was also inspiration for Darwin, for his theory of natural selection. Interestingly, we should realize that our current situation in the economy, where we see ever-growing consumption, ever-growing per capita wealth, has not always been like that. And that there was a long period, so in so-called Malthusian economy, where the achievements of economy produced additions of people, not increased per capita prosperity. So here, this is the space between population and GDP per capita in England. Starting on the 13th century, nothing much was happening, no population changes, no development, no increase in wealth, everything goes in circles. Then there was a Black Death epidemics, which reduced number of people to less than half of the population, which actually led to labor shortages and increased wages and increased per capita wealth. But after that, there was 200 years period where you can see that the GDP per capita remained remarkably steady, but the population increased to much higher levels than it was before the epidemics. And only after that, at about 17th century, that pattern broke, and we started adding per capita wealth at much slower increasing population. And that is the pattern we have been seeing ever since. So when we look at the analysis between different countries, then the increased land productivity transformed into increased population density, at least in the year 1500. While when you look at the GDP per capita, there was basically no effect. So again, between countries, the same effect as in England over time. Any economic productivity translated in more people, not in higher wealth per person. That is certainly not the world which we are living in. We are used to increasing wealth all the time. So this is GDP per capita, and again we can see a universal pattern of exponential increase in the last century. Again, as opposed to steady state between, in this case, between 14th and 18th centuries, where most of the countries were pretty steady in their GDP per capita. So that was, of course, because of technology, this kind of change in pattern and technology, industrial revolution. And so we should, as environmentalists, we should also look at what are the main mechanisms and the rules for development of technology. And I would say there are 4 interesting points which I will discuss. One is that it develops in unpredictable directions. We always try to predict where technology will go, and we always fail to do so at longer periods of time. So, for instance, everybody predicted flying cars. By now, we don't have them. And nobody really predicted the internet. This is the Time magazine cover in 1965, envisaging, again, huge room sized computers with some kind of corporate settings. But not long after that, 1965, some of us were already alive. In 1991, Tim Berners-Lee invented World Wide Web. This is the first website ever launched by him. It's still archived. And again, these effects of internet were completely unpredictable. Another point is that progress can escalate very rapidly. This is a famous Moore rule by co-founder of Intel, a chip-making company, who in 1975 observed that the number of transistors on an integrated chip doubles every 2 years. And that's just empirical observation, but it was really amazing how long it has lasted. Basically, that rule has been the case over last almost half a century, which is remarkable because this is an exponential growth. Now it looks like it will probably cease to be in effect because of physical limits. The size of transistors is hitting, but this is an extremely fast development of technology. Nobody really in 1975, absolutely nobody expected this will hold for so long. That applies to other aspects of computer technology. For instance, you can see this is a 5 megabyte hard drive in 1956, which weighted half a ton. The genome sequencing here expressed as the cost per base. This is the cost for how many bases actually you can sequence for $1,000. And initially it followed Moore's law. You note that the cost is the number of bases is on logarithmic scale, but then it got really crazy, double exponential, and went even faster, while now we are back again to the old-fashioned Moore's law. So there has been several orders of magnitude increase in our efficiency of genome sequencing. Even chickens follow Moore's law. There was a paper in 2014 in Poultry Science. When you are a conservation biologist, you have to draw information from different sources. And when you look at the weight of a standard mass-reared chicken at 56 days, then the weight doubles every 20 years. So at least from 1957 to 2005, if it still holds, then we should be looking forward to 9-kilogram chickens at 2025. This is the cost of solar energy, again on logarithmic scale, clearly falling in compliance with the Moore's law. Many other technologies have this kind of dynamics. Not all of them. Coal energy production hasn't changed in terms of cost for 100 years, and nuclear energy, unfortunately, because of the political reputation it gained, has actually increased in the costs per megawatt hour of energy. Now, this escalating progress can, of course, create unforeseen problems. The progress also can be measured by adoption of new technologies by people. This is United States households, the percentage having running water, toilets, electric power, and landline phones, which also shows that technology can also fall very, very rapidly and be abundant. So basically, we got from the adoption of electricity very fast in the States at the early 20th century, through even faster adoption of computers, and then internet, and then social media usage. So basically, the electricity brought us social bubbles in only 100 years' time. And of course, completely unpredictable consequences. Sometimes we misjudge the advent of new technology and the ability to solve and cause problems. We should realize that automobiles were actually a solution to an ecological problem. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, big cities were completely full of horse-drawn carriages. New York had 170,000 horses, which produced 2,000 tons of manure every day. So there were scary articles in the newspaper anticipating that the streets will be completely covered by horse manure if that technology continues to develop. Nobody really expected that this was non-issue at the time already, because the automobiles were coming. The exchange of horses to cars was astonishingly fast in the US, changing from 20% automobiles, 80% horses in 1910 to the opposite ratio in 1920. That's something to think about when we are discussing how we can change current fossil fuels automobiles to a different way of doing things. Now, technological progress can be employed very efficiently in solving environmental problems, not only creating them. This is a very well-known case of ozone hole problem, where agents, chemical agents, freons used in refrigeration were, after release to atmosphere, were attacking the ozone layer and basically dissolving the ozone molecules into oxygen radicals and oxygen O2 molecules. And that process went very fast. Basically, one molecule of freon like substances destroying thousands and thousands of ozone molecules. And so this actually caused a very clear increase in ozone hole in the Antarctic, and it was of concern because ozone, of course, is protecting land surface from radiation. So very serious problem. However, it was solved by replacing these refrigeration agents by others which are not destroying the ozone. This is the consumption of the problematic substances, which you can see went down extremely fast in the space of 25 years. And indeed, the ozone hole at least stabilized. This is the ozone concentrations clearly declining in the 80s and 90s, and now stabilized or on slight increase. The same goes for the ozone hole in the Antarctic. So this was a very successful solution, and it was a purely technological solution. This is in sharp contrast with what happened to carbon dioxide after Kyoto, which you can see here. That just continued growing while the international agreements on global ozone were successful. Why is that? Well, because we don't have such an easy replacement for carbon dioxide emitting technology, and that's basically challenge to develop this kind of technology. Unfortunately, lots of people takes it wrong way and thinks that this is a challenge to change the problem, to alleviate the problem by social engineering and changing lifestyle. So for them, we can just think about how that would go with ozone hole if we did not develop a replacement for freons and instead started a campaign for abandon the refrigeration. We should target, this is the percentage of US households having a fridge, which basically has been steady at 100% for the last 80 years. And so the campaign would probably introduce some terms like guilt from using a fridge. We can always use Scandinavians. Swedish, it will be killing scam, like we have now guilt from using trains for global warming, or shame from air conditioning, Luft conditioning scam. And then there will be campaign for people to abandon refrigeration, buy fresh market food and eat it quickly. You know, we could have a very nice campaign. People could be chaining themselves to the fridges in the shops, but of course, this would have been a complete disaster, and without technology, we would have been probably already fried on the ozone-less planet. So I think this is a serious lesson for how we should be dealing with the climate change. Unfortunately, this is not how it looks like. With carbon-based economy, you can be guilty of producing carbon dioxide whatever you do. You know, there is a book which has a very good title about the work is ruining the world. So as long as we have carbon-based economy, then whatever you do, even if initially you don't produce carbon dioxide, if you buy vegetarian food, then it also depends what the one who is running the shop, selling you the food will do, and finally it will still end up producing carbon dioxide. So you can, it's an endless opportunity for guilt politics. You know, you can have all these activities, how much they produce of the emissions, and whatever you do, there will always be some chink in your armor. It has been documented that very environmental conscious people who are vegetarian, recycle, don't use cars, then they fly to a holiday and basically destroy all their carbon dioxide savings. You should not have kids, of course. That's the biggest carbon dioxide investment you can make. Also, your pets are actually wrong. You know, you can, this is ecological footprint for different pets. So you probably should have a hamster at most, certainly forget about dogs. Even Googling something, Google searches have their carbon footprint. You can basically endlessly play with that and make everybody splendidly guilty about that. When you actually think what you should do, then buying an expensive piece of art is the best carbon-free investment of your money. You know, this is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who sold for $100 million in 2017. That painting just hangs there. Maybe you can air condition it with some carbon footprint, but I can't really imagine how better spend $100 million in a carbon-free way than buying that painting. Certainly not giving it to middle class who will use it to build houses, go for holidays. This is actually another issue where some people can pretend that reducing carbon and social justice are going hand in hand. Quite the opposite. Now, when we are trying to model what's going to happen with our civilization, then of course the development of technologies has crucial role in that. And one of the first attempts for that was the modeling of the Club of Rome in 1968. That's when the computers were becoming manageable, only size of a room. And so a number of scientists made a fairly simple model, which was premised on the decline in resources, which will cause their higher cost, which will cause also decline in food per capita food production, and that will lead to serious decline in population. So basically declining food production, declining industrial output will cause increased mortality and then population crash. And then, of course, the driving force of declining resources is continued technology with increasing population size. And so that decline in population will be forced by general disaster. And that model underestimated the power of technology to find new resources and use them more efficiently. Basically, it's Malthusian. It's Malthusian model again, and it's of course correct in the sense that exponential growth of population can't go endlessly, because that will fuel exponential growth. And as has been nicely put by Boulding in 1973, and that quote is often stolen and attributed to some more famous celebrities than him. Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever is, in a finite world, is either a madman or an economist. However, in the 1980 to 1990 window, where the resources were predicted to decline and their cost increase, another economist, Julian Simon, challenged Paul Ehrlich, well-known environmentalist, for $10,000 to pick up several resources, and where he believes that they will follow the Klapov-Rowe model and increase in price. Ehrlich picked up copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten, and he lost for all of them. They were all cheaper 10 years later because of technology. So this is the Rowe model with different parts highlighted. So resources go down, population goes up, and therefore food per capita after going up crashes, and industrial output crashes, and then with some delay population also crashes. In fact, the reality has been much more positive. We have managed to increase food production in line with population, and even slightly increase the per capita food production, which led to decrease in food prices from the 60s to this is until 2005. It will continue to this day. This is mostly because of advance in Asia and South America, while Africa is keeping per capita production steady, which in itself is still achievement considering the increasing population there. That led to other positive developments. The percentage of undernourished people in global population declined significantly from 14 to 11% in the 15 years, and the absolute number of undernourished also declined, although less spectacularly, because the whole population is increasing. This is the example of technological effects on food production, where these are the yields of barley, oats, and wheat in England, where people would be correct to believe that from 13 to 17th century, you could think that your yields of cereals are basically firmly given by nature or by God, and you can't simply do anything with them. But then, of course, from 17 to 12th to 20th century, the yields more than doubled. And so that could be seen as a fantastic progress, completely unaware of what's going to come in the 20th century, where suddenly they doubled again, and then they doubled again. So that was the Green Revolution, and duly followed by decline in prices of wheat in England and elsewhere. However, the Green Revolution, it has been great success. This is global production of cereals. And that, of course, requires also great inputs. These are the industrial fertilizers, again, global inputs, and the water. And so currently, the Green Revolution is running out of steam. First, it's more and more difficult to keep increasing these inputs. And second, these inputs are no longer producing increase in yield. Basically, lots of agriculture is saturated by industrial fertilizers, and so supplying further and further nitrogen is not simply helping. So this is the nitrogen efficiency. That means the amount of cereal per fertilizer unit, and you can see that basically we are at constant at constant rate for the last 20 years. So what next? Basically, clearly, we can't advocate eating less. The population is on increase still, and so we just need another green revolution. How can we achieve that? Well, the answer is very clear: genetic modification. This is actually one of the biggest sins of environmentalists, to oppose genetically modified crops. So, as I have indicated, because of this development of technology, agriculture and other, the last 30 years, although many people don't realize that, has been a time of economic miracle, and the highest number of people in history were lifted from extreme poverty. If you define extreme poverty as $2 per day, then this is the number of people living in on that economic level, and those who are not. So first, any percentage is confused by huge absolute number increase in population, but still you can see that even the percentage of people are declining. So these are different wealth levels, from wealthy, defined as $10 a day, increasing their share on the population from 1980 to 2015, and extreme poverty declining. So this is excellent news. Where the number of people living in extreme poverty are now, this is 2013, mostly in India, and then secondly Nigeria, and then Democratic Republic of Congo. The predictions tell us that in India they will lift out of their poverty, and so towards the end of the century, it will be only Africa which will have some extremely poor people. And so basically, how in terms of their ecological footprint, the 218 million people in India will get lifted out of their poverty is a very important environmental question. And again, the outcome depends on technology. It doesn't depend really on social engineering, changing your lifestyle, because if you are in extreme poverty, of course, you want to change your lifestyle, and that's going to happen whenever you have a chance. This importance of India is as assuming, as unfortunately seems likely, that Nigerians and Congolese will stay poor for a while, although I would argue that certainly not indefinitely. When you actually ask people, this was a question in Great Britain, asking people with a university degree, if you ask them whether in the last 30 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty has either increased, remained the same, or decreased, then only 12% of people, of university educated people, get the answer right, that it decreased. That was a question asked by Hans Rosling, and he's creator of these bubble graphs I'm showing, and has an extremely interesting book which is called Effectfulness. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, and we can call that Hans Rosling's Chimp Paradox, because if you ask chimpanzees the same question instead of university educated people in Great Britain, and I'm pretty sure everywhere else, then if they randomly pick the answer, then they will get it 33% right, as opposed to 12%, which is reality. So our university educated population is not only uninformed, it's actually about these issues. It's actually misinformed, so their views are less correct than you would expect by randomly answering the questions. The importance of GDP and the technology underlying it is also for the democracy and the willingness of people to even contemplate environmental issues. You know, when you have less than $10,000 per capita GDP, then less than 50% of population is satisfied with their living standards, and that means that they are not really open to contemplate any kind of self-limitation for the sake of environment. When you go to 30,000, that makes 75% of population satisfied, and that is where we want to be if the environmental conservation should have a chance for success. Finally, and this is a bit digressing elsewhere, the question if money can buy you happiness. These are different countries and how people in them rate their life on the scale of from 0 to 10, unhappy to happy. And again, the average shows that there is a fairly convincing correlation, although there are some regional differences. When you look at South America, it tends to be more cheerful than justified by economy, while Asia tends to be more grumpy. And also, one conclusion is that happiness is very expensive because the GDP axis is logarithmic. And so an increase in happiness, it goes fast first, but then for rich countries, it's actually quite expensive. Okay, now we are getting to the second part of the environmental impact equation, from technology to population size, because everything we achieve in personal lives have to be multiplied by the global number of people, and there we have absolutely astonishing increase in population, especially when you look at longer time scale. For instance, here you have 12,000 years, and you can see on arithmetic scale that we have been increasing in population extremely fast. You can check the estimated population on internet. There is a clock counting that, and on March 10 we had 7.8 billion people, with every day 40,000 new people coming to the planet, and so we have to cater for their needs. So population is really the foundation of all the environmental impacts, no matter how you look at it. Of course, the problem is that population growth is an exponential process, and we as people have very vague notion of how fast exponential growth can be. Now it's probably a bit better with COVID epidemics spreading exponentially. People are paying more attention to very fast dynamics of exponential processes. There is a well-known story about sage in India playing chess and asking the opponent for what looked like a humble reward in case of winning, where he would get 1 grain of rice on the first chessboard square, and then double it every next square. So we will get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It looks very innocent, but then of course, if you continue for the whole 64 chessboard squares, then you get something in the order of 10 to the power of 19 rice grains, which translates to about 50 kilograms of rice on every square meter of the Indian territory. And so likewise, human population growing 2%, which is higher but realistic growth rate, which many countries achieve. That means that annually it will double every 35 years. So this analogy with chessboard, you get from a single person or 2 persons, if you like, from sort of paradise situation to the completely impossible numbers after 64 generations of 35 years, which is not, by human history, not a very long time. So that means that this 2% increase can't really continue endlessly. Also, one of the feature of exponential population growth is that if you model it far in the future, then without actually changing the parameters of that growth, the prediction is always scary and very rarely realistic over the long periods of time. You either come to the conclusion that your nation, the whole humanity, whatever, will go extinct, or that will go seriously overpopulated. There is no other option if you model long-term exponential growth with constant parameters. So, for instance, if we look at the slowest country in terms of reproduction, which is South Korea, currently fertility 1.4 children per woman, then its population would decline from 52 million to merely 8 million people in 5 generations. When you look at Niger, the fastest growing country with 6.9 children per woman, then the population over 5 generations will go from current 23 million to 3.2 billion people. So again, these are quite unrealistic predictions. However, when we look at how human population actually grew, then you can see this is the number of people in blue, and red is the annual population growth. And indeed, you can see that in the first half of the 20th century, there was a radical increase in growth rate to the peak in 1960s, 2.1%, completely unsustainable. And so the intellectuals and biologists led by Paul Ehrlich again were panicking, and in this time completely justifiably. The Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, was quite scary, but quite right. We can't really continue this. So what happened after all these intellectuals warning governments? Well, the only government who listened was a totalitarian post-Maoist China, which in 1979 introduced one-child policy and was very much appreciated by liberal intellectuals in the West. But then what happened very strangely is this period of fairly rapid decline in growth rate. So the population still keeps growing, the growth rate is positive, but there was a rapid decline. That was not because of China and one-child policy. That was a coordinated process in many other countries, and it was completely unforeseen. Nobody really predicted it, and we are really lucky that to happen. So that just shows how we don't really understand simple population dynamics of our own species. This is really scientific failure I mean, it's a lucky one, but this really should be taken seriously as a deficiency in science of the human species. Now, looking at the Chinese one-child policy, we should say that only a totalitarian country can achieve that. It did help with population growth, but it had a lot of negative effects on families, of course, but also on the general demography. So it's something not to be replicated, but that should not stop us from evaluating its impact. And there is actually controversy about it, because official Chinese estimate is that it prevented 400 million births. That was internationally rejected as exaggeration. And however, there has been a recent paper which is titled "The Astonishing Population Averted by China's Birth Restrictions" by Daniel Gutkind, and that was severely contested. But he actually did a rigorous job of comparing China with Vietnam as a single country, then with a group of 16 countries matched by different social and economic parameters, and then with India as a different country. It was not a serious comparison. And then looked at population sizes before and after one-child policy, and then came to the conclusion that actually that policy prevented something between 360 and 520 million births by 2015. So in line with Chinese estimates, and that estimate will double by 2060. Why double? Of course, because there are births prevented to the existing mothers, but then these births will have in the next generation their own children, and so that number of averted mothers will improve the whole estimate. These conclusions were criticized as scientifically highly flawed. Maybe I'm not expert in that, but also as morally responsible. This is something which should have no place in that. We should be really very coldly assessing what were the effect of that. One-child policy doesn't mean we condone it, but we need to evaluate these effects. So not talking about the environmentally undoubtedly positive effects it had would be just wrong. Of course, the real problem is that it's a non-replicated experiment, and so it's true that society responds to a lot of factors, and they are not the same in every country. But also, this had other side effects, maybe unexpected, and one of them was increased abortion of girls, because every family in China, or most of the families, want to have at least one boy. If you have one-child policy, then this is the proportion of boys as the first child in the one-child policy areas of China, and in areas mostly populated by ethnic minorities, which did not have that policy. And you can see that this is more like controlled experiment, and you can see that there is a high increase in a sex ratio of newborn children, and that is actually even worse in the second child when it was allowed. So why we have this kind of demographic increase suddenly? Well, that's called demographic transition. It has a predictably it's a predictable process. It has predictable stages, and it took place in countries which currently are no longer growing, such as European countries in the past, and now is taking place in the tropical countries still growing. So basically, there is initially a balance between high death rate and high birth rate. Then death rate goes down because of the progress in hygiene and medicine and economic standards, with birth rate lagging behind that in decline, and then finally getting decline again, leading to a new balance between low birth rate and low death rate. These are examples of demographic transition in England and Wales, which happened basically at the turn of 18th, 19th century. Sweden, the same progress, and a more modern one in Mauritius, where the decline, as in many other developing countries, in mortality happened in 1950s, the post-war, and finally we are getting, after 60 years of growth, Mauritius is getting close towards sustained population rate. The bad news is that human fertility is not density dependent. These are countries with the number of babies per woman lifetime, so that's the measure of fertility, and their population density. There is no correlation. Doesn't mean that population density will somehow, through social effects, slow the population growth and change the size of the families. However, the good news is that human fertility is income dependent. So this is the income per capita, and this is again babies per woman. And you can see again, for a social phenomenon, extremely good correlation, where the more wealthy you are, the fewer children you have. And that goes across cultures, across different economical levels. So this is the path towards lower population growth, for everybody to get rich. And I think, lots of people can get on board with this concept. We need to get to 2.1 children per woman, which is a steady state population, because not everybody procreates, not everybody has children, and so 2.1 children is a steady population, and lots of countries already achieve that. Those fast growing are mostly blue here, which means Africa. So what we need is to get to 2.1 which is among others Sri Lanka. So we need to get everybody to 12,000 US dollars per capita to achieve sustainable population, even at the cost of some environmental damage. I mean, the environmental damage by economic growth to that level will be more than compensated by slower population growth. These are trajectories of 55 developing countries, showing again the fertility decline when over time they are getting richer. And you can see that there is a very fast decline with even a very low increase in wealth. So we need to really get countries out of very serious poverty to, as the best, most acceptable way of reducing humanity's environmental impact. Now, of course, lifetime fertility is correlated with many things because it's correlated with economy. That has also effects on lifestyle, and so you can put a lot of correlations there. For instance, there is a correlation, negative one, with infant mortality. So this is 1950s babies per woman, and against babies per woman against child mortality, children dying per 1,000 newborns. And you can see that there is a negative correlation with yellow, which means European and European countries mostly firmly in the lead, together with US and Japan. And over the time, there have been a universal progress towards very desirable left lower corner, which means low child mortality and low reproduction, but to a different extent. With Europe's moving there, but shortly, but then especially the long journey by South American and Asian countries, and much shorter by African. So this is the current situation, 2019. There is still negative correlation. Everybody moved to more favorable areas. For instance, even the worst countries no longer have more than 100 children per 1,000 newborns dying, which is still a lot, but it was much more serious in many more countries in the 1950s. But then we need to move everybody there to this sustainable population. You can say that, well, if there is a high fertility, isn't it compensated by child mortality? However cold and cruel it might seem, then it could be seen as a compensating factor. It's not like that, because human population, by increased reproduction in a condition of high child mortality, overcompensate. So when we have two examples, you know, the blue example, mortality of newborns 1%. So that's 10 children per 1,000 newborns, and that corresponds to roughly 2 babies per mother. When we look at 3% mortality, that corresponds to 3 babies per mother. That's the green reading. But that means that for the blue situation, if we have 100 mothers, it means 200 babies, 2 of them die, so 198 live. In the green situation, it's 300 babies, 9 of them die, and so many more, 291 are alive. So this is overcompensation. So ironically, the higher infant mortality, the faster the population grows. This is the current situation. This is the current correlation between infant mortality and lifetime fertility. And we can also look at the changes over time for selected countries. So you can see Nigeria starting from really bad situation and slightly improving. Then you can see Brazil. These are trajectories from 1950, and Brazil going extremely long way to that situation at the moment, and then France again from 1950 to the current 2020. So we can say that Nigeria now is demographically at where Brazil was 1968, and Brazil now is where France was in 1990. So there is a important shift, and lots of countries which used to be developing countries like Brazil are no longer like that demographically. Also, long-living people have fewer children. This is 120 years ago. And you had basically everybody was dying fast except for Europe, US, and Japan. Then in 1950s, we had actually truly developed and developing countries, two clusters with very, very few intermediate cases. We had a cluster of low fertility, low living societies and short living, high fertility ones. What happened since then is that there was a change from two clusters, developed and developing countries, to a gradient, where especially Asian countries stretched along the whole continuum. And so we have a gradient, and you can see that that African countries are lagging in that. It's almost exclusively African countries at the tail of the relationship. Now, we can, of course, model this decline in fertility with different driving social aspects. And so, for instance, this is a recent paper in Lancet this year, which models these are trajectories of individual countries, total fertility, and against the number of years of education by women. And then combined with the contraceptive need which is met. So 100% means women have all the contraceptives they feel they need, 0 they have none. And so you have these lines basically fitting the years of education for different contraceptive needs. And so when we look at again desirable value 2.1 children per woman, then it looks like if we give full access to contraceptives combined with 10 years of education to all women, then the population problem is solved. This is a different analysis of the same problem. These are again trajectories of individual countries, real trajectories over the years, and how the female literacy rate for 15 years old is affecting or is being correlated at least with the fertility. And again, you can see that education of women is appearing, it can be a false correlation with some underlying factor, but it does appear to be really a very important social aspect driving population size. So basically, education is one of the best conservation activities you can do. Regarding the contraceptives, the social surveys show that typically people have more children than they actually want all over the world, certainly in South America and Asia, but especially in Africa. In Africa, they want more children than elsewhere, but the access of what actually they have is much bigger than in Asia and Africa. And then when they were asking women whether they have contraception they need, then there was about a quarter of women in Africa and about 15 to 20% in Asia who said that they don't. Why they don't? Interestingly, it's not cost or actual access, it's a social aspect, that they are concerned about the side effects, or that their society or most often their partner are opposed to their use, or they themselves are opposed. These are the main factors both in Asia and in Africa. In that context, it's interesting to read autobiography of the father of the pill, who developed the first efficient hormone-based contraceptives, who is arguing that in the current climate, political, economical, in the pharmaceutical industry, it's very unlikely that there will be a significant progress in developing more and better contraceptives, which unfortunately goes against the side effects being the main concern of people using them. Here, it also deserves mention that there are clinics Marie Stopes International. These are clinics active in many countries of the world, which their goal is, among others, to open access to women to contraceptives. And it's named after a British author, paleobotanist, eugenicist, and women's rights campaigner Marie Stopes. Very progressive woman in some aspects. Unfortunately, the Marie Stopes changed their name to very alibistic MS clinics, because as a eugenicist, Marie Stopes became, at least in 2020, politically equivocal. So why not to use her name? We can just use her initials and everything will be fine. So what is the prediction of our population growth globally? Well, it's no longer terrifying, but still serious. This is the United Nations predictions with different scenarios, which apart from the terrifying extreme ones, show that the population will probably peak by the end of the century, and at not entirely unreasonable 11 billion people. It's too much, of course, but I think the planet can feed these people without a disaster. Of course, the fewer the better. This is the same predictions for different scenarios of the children per woman. When we look regionally, then basically whatever happens depends on Africa. Asia is without any questions going to decline in terms of population. All the other continents don't matter at all, and so all the predictions depends on final adjustments of the models for Africa. This is a different analysis which again put in play contraceptives and female education. And so it shows that in the terrifying scenario of no contraception and no progress in education, we will be getting ever-growing population by the end of the century, approaching 14 billion. Hopefully, we will go with one of these more optimistic scenarios. The yellow one, the best one, is when the countries will meet the Sustainable Development Goals by United Nations, which of course include education, but that's rather optimistic. And these are again scenarios for different global fertility and for different African fertility, and that is what will define whether the population is still growing after 2050 or not. What happens in Africa? Some individual countries, China, whatever happens, China already has contraceptives, it already has education, so different scenarios are not much different. Everything will go predictably declining population size. India will peak in the second half of the century, and then again, whatever happens will decline. What is really important are Nigeria and Congo, which have a very wide range of scenarios. Some of them are not declining. And so, the terrifying scenario for Nigeria is that it will have 1.5 billion people by the end of the century. For Congo, it will have 400 million people. Seems to be completely fantastic, but there is actually a possibility. The United States, as the only big developed country here, will again pose no mystery. There are different scenarios which basically end at very similar outcomes. So this model show these are the countries where the net reproduction rate falls below the replacement level by certain year. So only the dark red are the countries which are predicted to continue growing even beyond 2100. This is based on the most plausible scenarios, while the blue and light blue countries are already declining, including entire Europe, as you can see. So we can have 9 sort of take-home messages, 9 conclusions from this lecture. Primary problem: growing human population. Good news: human fertility is income dependent. More good news: in 30 years, many people have been lifted from poverty, saving us from the overpopulation catastrophe. Ozone hole lesson: technology, not social engineering, solves environmental problems. Conservation is not a religion rewarding ascetic lifestyle or cultivating apocalyptic expectations. We should really remember that some of the environmentalists don't. Techno-optimism: technology is there to solve pressing environmental problems and, of course, cause new ones. We should not stifle them by precautionary approach, like we did for genetic engineering and also for nuclear power. Precautionary approach is one of the most terrible invention of environmental movement, I have to say. Technology to create wealth is necessary if we want to keep the global population falling. So it's not only a matter of greed, it's also a matter of a rational choice. We need to be wealthy, we need to become rich because we have to. That means Sri Lankan style for everybody, 12,000 per year to achieve sustainable population, and also get more than 50% of population satisfied with their living standards, opening opportunities for conservation sentiments in these countries. Access to contraceptives and 10 years of education for all women will make it for sustainable population. And whether the world will overpopulate or not in the 21st century is all in the hands of Africans. So perhaps we could or we should help them. So please let us not wait for happy apocalypse, or let us not predict it, and try to be rational in facing our environmental challenges. Thank you.